The office gleamed with glass and steel, polished floors reflecting the morning light as though success itself was shining through them. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with ambition, the kind of cold, fast-paced energy that left no room for mistakes or emotion. It was the headquarters of Brightcore Analytics, one of the top consulting firms in the city. Behind his grand mahogany desk sat Ethan Cole, the CEO, a man whose pride matched the size of the building he owned. Sharp suit, sharper tone, and a reputation for being results only. He didn't believe in second chances, and he certainly didn't believe in diversity for diversity's sake. Ethan judged people by how they looked, how they spoke, and how much they resembled him. That morning, the HR team had arranged an interview for the company's open analyst position, a role Ethan personally wanted to fill after a string of costly errors by previous employees. He expected the usual candidates polished, confident, and, in his mind, professional-looking. Then Amina Rahman walked in. She was qualified beyond measure, a graduate of one of the best universities in the country, fluent in 3 languages, with a decade of experience in data strategy. Her resume alone should have guaranteed her a place on his team. But as soon as Ethan saw her walk through the glass door, his expression hardened. She wore a simple navy hijab, neatly pinned, her posture poised, her demeanor calm. Yet to him, that one visible symbol of faith was all it took to erase everything on her resume. His mind formed assumptions faster than reason could intervene. He listened half-heartedly as she spoke about her work, how she'd streamlined data systems, saved previous employers millions, led projects across multiple countries. But all Ethan saw was difference. To him, she didn't fit the company image. When the interview ended, she thanked him with quiet grace. He didn't return the smile. By the afternoon, her rejection letter had already been sent. Polite, generic, and dismissive, it read, "While we were impressed with your background, we've decided to move forward with other candidates." Amina sat in her small apartment that evening, staring at the email. It wasn't the first time. Over the years, she had learned to read between the lines, to see the discrimination hidden behind corporate politeness. Still, it stung every time. Meanwhile, Ethan leaned back in his chair, feeling satisfied. He had hired someone else, a man named Ryan, confident and smooth, talking but inexperienced. He told himself he'd made the right choice. After all, business wasn't about emotions. It was about image and control. For a while, things seemed fine. Projects moved, deals closed, and profits rolled in. But beneath the surface, cracks began to appear. Mistakes went unnoticed, deadlines slipped, and clients started complaining about inconsistencies in the data. Ethan brushed it off as temporary setbacks, until one fateful week when everything unraveled. A massive client, a multi-million-dollar account, accused Brightcore of serious miscalculations that cost them huge losses. The client threatened to pull out and sue. Panic spread through the office like wildfire. Emails flew, meetings piled up, and employees whispered in hallways about the possible collapse of the company. Ethan's arrogance turned to desperation. He demanded answers, but none came. The same employee he had hired instead of Amina had made critical errors that no one could easily fix. The system was too complex, too broken. One by one, clients began withdrawing their contracts. Stockholders started calling. Investors wanted explanations. Brightcore's empire was trembling. For the first time in years, Ethan felt fear creeping in, not just of losing money, but of losing control. Late one night, sitting in his dimly lit office, he stared at the growing pile of reports on his desk. Numbers blurred together. His chest tightened with stress and exhaustion. He needed someone who understood complex data architecture, someone who could rebuild what had collapsed, and fast. Then, buried in an old email thread, he saw her name again, Amina Rahman. Her resume still sat in his inbox, untouched. As he skimmed it again, he realized what he had overlooked, or rather, what he had refused to see. Her experience in predictive analytics was exactly what his company needed. Her skills were the missing piece. But even as the thought crossed his mind, his pride resisted. Could he really call her? The woman he had dismissed so easily. The one who had walked into his office confident, capable, and invisible to him because of a single piece of cloth on her head. The next morning, the board demanded immediate action. If the company didn't stabilize its systems within 2 weeks, Brightcore would be forced into bankruptcy. Investors were already pulling out. Ethan's walls of arrogance began to crumble. For the first time in his career, he faced the reality that his bias, the quiet prejudice he had always justified, might be the reason his empire was falling apart. That night, unable to sleep, he opened his email and stared at Amina's contact information. He hovered over the keyboard, hesitating. His pride fought him every second, but the company's survival depended on a choice he never imagined he'd have to make. Finally, with trembling fingers, he typed a message. Short, urgent, almost pleading. He pressed send, and as the email disappeared into cyberspace, Ethan leaned back and exhaled. He had no idea if she'd even respond. But somewhere across the city, Amina's phone buzzed softly on her nightstand. She reached for it, her eyes scanning the name in disbelief. Her lips parted slightly as she read the message. The same man who had once refused to hire her, now asking for help. The tables had turned. When Amina saw Ethan's name appear in her inbox, her first instinct was disbelief. The same CEO who couldn't look her in the eye during her interview, who dismissed her capabilities without a second thought, was now reaching out for help. For several minutes, she just stared at the email, the cursor blinking at the end of his desperate message. He had written that his company was in crisis, that they needed someone with her expertise, immediately. The tone was professional, but the undertone was clear. He was pleading. She sat back in her chair, the irony washing over her like a cold wave. It wasn't just an offer, it was poetic justice. The very man who had decided she didn't fit. His company now realized she was the only one who could save it. But Amina wasn't quick to reply. She had spent years working harder than anyone else, constantly underestimated, constantly judged. Not for her work, but for her faith, her accent, and her appearance. She remembered every rejection that came after promising interviews, every patronizing tone that said you don't belong here. This message wasn't just from Ethan Cole. It was from every door that had been slammed in her face. Still, she wasn't someone who acted out of anger. She was strategic, deliberate, and proud of the integrity that kept her grounded. That night, she prayed for guidance, not for revenge, but for strength. By morning, her decision was clear. She replied to the email with calm professionalism, stating her conditions. She would not join as an employee, but as an independent consultant. Her fees would be high, and her terms absolute. If Ethan wanted her expertise, he would have to respect her authority. When Ethan received her reply, he hesitated. Her rate was steep, far more than he had planned to pay. But he knew he had no choice. His team had already failed him. The data systems were in chaos, and his investors were losing faith by the day. For once, Ethan had to swallow his pride. He signed the agreement, and within 48 hours, Amina walked through the doors of Brightcore once again. This time, not as a hopeful job applicant, but as the company's last chance at survival. The moment she stepped into the office, whispers began. Employees glanced at her hijab, exchanged curious looks, and murmured under their breath. The same subtle prejudice that had followed her for years was alive and well within those glass walls. But Amina had grown used to it. She had learned that dignity was her armor. Ethan greeted her awkwardly. He avoided her eyes at first, his usual confidence replaced by tension. He guided her through the office, explaining the scope of the disaster. She listened quietly, nodding, taking notes, not once acknowledging the irony of the situation. When she sat down at the computer, she quickly realized how deep the problems went. Corrupted data, broken algorithms, incomplete reports. It was a web of failure that stemmed from ignorance and negligence. The systems hadn't been maintained properly, and the analytics were riddled with inconsistencies. Amina got to work immediately. Hours turned into days as she rebuilt the company's core systems piece by piece. Her expertise began to show in every report she fixed, every process she streamlined. Slowly, Brightcore's numbers started to stabilize. For the first time in weeks, clients began to regain confidence. Meanwhile, Ethan watched her in silence. He noticed how she carried herself, calm, precise, unbothered by the stares or the whispers. Her focus was unshakable. Every assumption he had made about her, that she wouldn't fit, that she wasn't leadership material, now felt absurd. But admitting that would mean confronting something deeper, his own prejudice. Late one evening, after most employees had left, Ethan passed by her desk. She was still working, her eyes fixed on the glowing screen, fingers moving with quiet determination. There was something almost humbling about it, the grace with which she handled the very company that once rejected her. He wanted to thank her but couldn't find the words. Gratitude required humility, and he wasn't used to humility. Days later, during a board meeting, Amina presented her recovery plan. It was clear, bold, and efficient. the kind of leadership Ethan's team had lacked for months. The board members were impressed, asking her direct questions and listening intently. Some even suggested she be offered a senior role permanently. Ethan's jaw tightened at the idea. The very thought of hiring her full-time, after he'd dismissed her, stung his ego. But deep down, he knew they were right. She had done what none of his hand-picked employees could. After the meeting, he retreated to his office, conflicted. Every success Amina achieved was a reminder of his failure, not as a businessman but as a human being. And then came the breaking point. One morning, Ethan received a message from one of their largest clients, a powerful government agency that had been on the verge of canceling their contract. The message was short and astonishing. They were staying with Brightcore thanks to Amina's system overhaul. It wasn't just that she saved the account. Her new design had impressed them so much that they wanted to extend their partnership for another 5 years, a deal worth millions. Ethan was stunned. His company, which had been days from collapse, was suddenly back on top. All because of the woman he hadn't thought worthy of employment. That afternoon, when he saw her walking through the office, coworkers greeting her respectfully now, he realized something he couldn't ignore anymore. His own prejudice had almost destroyed everything he had built. But karma wasn't done yet, because while Amina's success had saved Brightcore, her growing influence within the company had also caught the attention of the board. And soon, Ethan would learn that saving the company wasn't the only thing Amina was destined to do. She was about to change its future, and his, forever. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere at Brightcore began to change, subtly at first, then unmistakably. What started as quiet admiration for Amina's work had turned into open respect. Her presence brought order where there had been chaos, confidence where there had been panic. Employees began to seek her advice, even those who once looked down on her. They came to her desk for guidance, for clarification, and for decisions that, until recently, only the CEO was trusted to make. And the most surprising part, Ethan noticed it all. He watched as she handled each situation with composure. She didn't raise her voice, didn't demand attention. Yet the room naturally shifted when she spoke. There was something magnetic about her calm authority, something he had never been able to command, despite his position. For the first time, Ethan felt the walls closing in. The company he had built was slipping from his control, not because of betrayal or rebellion, but because of something more powerful, competence. Amina had become the silent center of gravity holding everything together. And the board had noticed. Behind closed doors, the directors began to discuss new leadership structures. Brightcore's recovery had been so remarkable that investors wanted to expand operations. They wanted a new vision, one that reflected innovation and inclusivity, and they wanted Amina to lead it. At first, Ethan laughed it off. The idea of replacing him seemed impossible. But the whispers grew louder. Reports credited her directly for the turnaround. Clients mentioned her by name in their testimonials. The board began inviting her to meetings he wasn't even aware of. The irony was unbearable. The woman he had rejected because she didn't fit, now fit better than anyone else. But Amina wasn't driven by revenge. Her focus remained on the company's success. She didn't boast, didn't seek recognition. She worked tirelessly, her only goal being excellence. Yet, even her humility made her more respected, a quiet contrast to Ethan's arrogance. As the months passed, Brightcore flourished. New contracts came in, and the company's name began appearing in major industry publications. Amina's innovative data systems were described as game-changing, setting new standards for efficiency. But while the company's reputation soared, Ethan's began to crumble. His name was no longer associated with innovation, but with outdated leadership and mismanagement. His once confident stride through the office halls now felt heavy, as though every step echoed his diminishing power. Then came the board's decision, a closed-door meeting that would determine Brightcore's future. Ethan entered that room expecting resistance, perhaps a challenge to his ego. What he didn't expect was an ultimatum. The chairman, a man who had been his mentor for years, laid it out plainly. The investors wanted new leadership. They believed the company's success was tied directly to Amina's vision. Ethan could stay, but not as CEO. The board wanted her promoted. The room fell silent. Ethan sat frozen, staring at the faces around him, faces that once looked at him with admiration, now filled with caution and pity. In that moment, everything he had once believed, that power belonged to him, That control was his right dissolved. He left the meeting without a word. That night, he sat in his dark office long after everyone had gone home, staring at the city lights beyond the glass walls. The same skyline he had once looked at with pride now mocked him. And then, slowly, the truth began to settle in. This wasn't just about business. This was karma unfolding in its most poetic form. The same bias that had blinded him years ago, that had made him dismiss Amina as unfit, had cost him everything he valued. His downfall wasn't caused by betrayal or incompetence. It was caused by his own prejudice. Days later, the announcement was made public. Amina Rahman had been appointed the new CEO of Brightcore Technologies. The news spread quickly across the industry. Headlines praised her as the first woman, and the first Muslim in hijab, to lead a major tech company in the region. Articles celebrated her as a symbol of resilience and diversity. The reaction inside Brightcore was overwhelming. Employees applauded the decision, many genuinely inspired by her story. Amina, though grateful, remained humble. She accepted the role not with triumph but with quiet grace. Ethan, on the other hand, chose to remain in the company for a short transitional period, though everyone knew it was only temporary. The sight of Amina in his old office was a daily reminder of his failure, a mirror reflecting the prejudice that had undone him. Still, Amina treated him with the same respect she offered everyone. She made no attempt to humiliate him, no effort to gloat. Her professionalism only deepened the contrast between them. And yet, beneath the surface of her calm, there was something unspoken, not bitterness, but justice. Because while Ethan had once believed he was doing her a favor by giving her a chance, the truth was clear now. She had given him one, a chance to see himself, to confront the bias that had shaped his every decision. But destiny wasn't done teaching him. Because soon, Ethan's arrogance would cost him more than his title. A crisis was coming, one that would put both their lives on the line. And when it came, it would be Amina, the woman he had once rejected, who would decide whether he lived or lost everything forever. Amina's first weeks as CEO were a whirlwind of strategy meetings, media appearances, and decisive changes. The company seemed to hum with new energy under her leadership, a balance of strength and empathy that inspired everyone who worked there. She led with integrity, listening before speaking, and acting only when she was certain. Her vision was simple but powerful: to make Brightcore not just successful, but meaningful. She introduced diversity programs, mental health support, and scholarships for underrepresented youth in tech. For the first time, employees felt seen, valued, and heard. But outside the shining walls of the corporate office, trouble was brewing. The industry had begun to shift rapidly, and with progress came competition. A rival company, once a minor player, had started gaining traction by undercutting Brightcore's prices and leaking insider information. Contracts were being lost. Investors were growing anxious, and whispers of corporate sabotage began to spread. When the first internal security breach occurred, Amina knew it wasn't random. Someone inside the company was feeding sensitive data to competitors. Her instincts told her to investigate quietly, to trust her process. But beneath the calm, there was unease. She had seen this kind of betrayal before, not in business, but in life. Prejudice had always disguised itself as strategy, and disloyalty often wore the mask of necessity. Then, one morning, she received an email that froze her blood cold. A document, classified, confidential, had been traced back to Ethan's login credentials. The same Ethan who had once been her superior. The same Ethan who had refused to hire her. It didn't make sense. He was no longer in a leadership position. Why would he risk everything now? At first, she tried to reason it away. Perhaps someone had framed him, or his account had been compromised. But as evidence mounted, the truth began to surface. Ethan had been struggling financially since stepping down. He had debts, lawsuits from failed side ventures, and growing resentment toward the company he once led. And in his desperation, he had started selling internal information to Brightcore's rival. The betrayal was almost poetic, not because of what he did, but because of how far he had fallen. The man who once prided himself on control had lost it completely, surrendering to the same ego that had destroyed him before. When confronted, Ethan broke down. The facade of confidence he had worn for years crumbled. Beneath it was a man terrified of irrelevance, suffocating under the weight of his own regret. He didn't beg for forgiveness. He didn't even try to defend himself. He simply accepted the collapse he had created. For Amina, the discovery was both heartbreaking and liberating. She had spent years proving her worth to people like him. And now, standing before the man who had once dismissed her as unworthy, she realized she no longer needed validation. Still, the law was clear. Corporate espionage wasn't a minor infraction. The board demanded action. The company's security team was ready to hand over the evidence to the authorities. But something inside Amina hesitated. This was her chance, the moment of poetic justice. She could destroy him completely, the way he had once destroyed her. No one would question her decision. In fact, people would applaud it. It would be the perfect revenge. Yet when she looked at him, defeated, broken, hollow, she saw something else. Not the arrogant man who had mocked her, but a reflection of what hatred could do when it was left unchecked. A warning of what she could become if she let bitterness lead her choices. That night, she sat in her office long after everyone had gone home, the city lights flickering through the window like fading stars. She thought about her journey, from being rejected in an interview room to standing here, holding the future of the same man who had rejected her in her hands. Justice had arrived, but was it hers to deliver? The next morning, she made her decision. Instead of pressing charges, she arranged a confidential settlement. Ethan would resign officially, return every cent he had gained, and agree never to work in the industry again. In return, Brightcore would not pursue legal action. The board was surprised, even frustrated. They wanted vengeance, but Amina stood firm. The goal! She's to end the cycle, not continue it. And so, Ethan left quietly. No headlines, no scandals, no public humiliation. Just a silent departure of a man who once ruled and now walked away with nothing but shame. But as life would have it, the story didn't end there. Weeks later, while traveling to a regional conference, Amina's car was struck by a truck on a rain-soaked highway. Her driver was injured, and she was trapped in the wreckage. Within minutes, a passerby rushed to help, pulling open the crumpled door, shouting for assistance, and calling emergency services. When she opened her eyes through the haze of pain and glass, she saw a familiar face leaning over her. It was Ethan, the man she had spared, the man she had once saved from his own destruction. And now he was saving her. Rain poured in sheets across the highway that morning, blurring the world into streaks of gray and silver. The crash had come suddenly. A single second of impact that shattered metal, glass, and silence. Amina drifted in and out of consciousness, the sharp scent of gasoline and wet asphalt filling her lungs. The world tilted in flashes, headlights, sirens, rain hitting her face. And through it all, she heard a voice rough and trembling, calling for help. It was a voice she recognized. Ethan's. He had been driving home from a job interview when he saw the twisted wreck ahead. The smashed car was almost unrecognizable, its front end folded in like paper. Instinct had taken over. He pulled to the side, ran through the storm, and without hesitation began prying at the door. He didn't think about who was inside. Not until he saw her face. For a brief moment, time froze. The woman he had once humiliated, the woman who had spared him from ruin, was lying broken and bleeding in front of him. Panic gripped him. But he pushed through it, forcing open the crushed frame with every ounce of strength he had left. His hands blood. His shoulder ached. But he didn't stop. He kept shouting her name, kept telling her to stay awake. By the time paramedics arrived, he was soaked to the bone, his clothes stained with her blood. When they lifted her into the ambulance, Ethan climbed in without thinking. The medics didn't stop him, maybe because they could see the desperation in his eyes. He stayed with her the entire way to the hospital, his hands shaking, whispering prayers to a God he hadn't spoken to in years. Hours later, Amina was in surgery. The doctor said it was critical, broken ribs, internal bleeding, and a head injury that could go either way. Ethan sat outside the operating room, drenched, motionless, staring at the floor. He hadn't wept in decades, but now tears streamed freely down his face. He thought about everything that had led them here. Every word, every decision, every cruel assumption. He thought about the day he rejected her, the look on her face when he dismissed her as unfit. He thought about the years she spent proving herself, the quiet strength she carried, the grace she had shown even when she had every right to destroy him. And now she was fighting for her life. Hours turned into days. Amina remained unconscious, caught in a fragile stillness. Ethan never left the hospital. He brought flowers, paid for her medical bills anonymously, and spent every night in the waiting room, his body slumped in the same chair. News of the accident spread quickly. The company mourned publicly, praying for her recovery. Employees gathered outside the hospital in vigils, holding candles and sharing stories of how Amina had changed their lives. When the board discovered that Ethan had been the one who saved her, they reached out, thanking him for his courage. But Ethan refused praise. He didn't see what he did as heroism. He saw it as redemption, a final chance to do something right. Weeks later, Amina opened her eyes. The light hurt at first, and the world was slow to come into focus. She saw the white walls, the hum of machines, the faint scent of antiseptic. And then she saw him, sitting quietly beside her bed, asleep in a chair, his head bowed. He looked older now, worn and tired. His hair had gone grayer, his face thinner. But in that moment, she understood. He had changed. When Ethan woke, he didn't know what to say. The usual confidence was gone. All that remained was remorse. He wanted to apologize, to thank her, to confess everything, but words failed him. He didn't need to speak. She already knew. In the weeks that followed, Ethan stayed close, helping with her recovery, ensuring she had everything she needed. He volunteered to take on the administrative work she couldn't handle, working quietly in the background, expecting nothing in return. When she finally returned to Brightcore, walking with a cane but standing tall, the office erupted in applause. Employees cried, embracing her, thanking her for surviving, for leading them, even in silence. Amina smiled, but her gaze found Ethan, standing at the back of the room. He didn't join in the celebration. He simply watched, proud, content to remain unseen. Later that day, she called him into her office. He hesitated at the doorway, unsure if he was even worthy to stand there, but she gestured for him to sit. There were no words of blame, no lecture, only gratitude. In her calm, steady tone, she thanked him, not just for saving her life, but for finally understanding, for breaking the cycle. Ethan nodded, unable to meet her eyes. For the first time in his life, he felt peace. Not triumph, not success, but peace. Soon after, he announced that he was leaving the city for good. He planned to move to a small coastal town and start over, away from the noise, the greed, and the mistakes of his past. Before he left a letter on Amina's desk. A simple note that said, "Thank you for showing me what humanity looks like." Amina read it in silence. She didn't cry. She didn't smile. She simply folded the letter, placed it in her drawer, and closed it gently. The following week, Brightcore held a company-wide event, a celebration of unity, resilience, and transformation. Amina took the stage, her voice calm but powerful. She spoke about forgiveness, about strength, and about how change begins when we face the truths we once ran from. And somewhere far away, on a quiet coastline, Ethan watched the broadcast. His eyes welled with tears as he heard her voice. The same voice he once silenced, now echoing across the nation. The same voice that had once been rejected for what she wore now inspired thousands. It was the sound of justice, of grace, of redemption. But fate still had one more surprise left, one that would bring their story to a full, unexpected circle. Because the company they built together was about to face a crisis that neither of them could ignore. Months passed since Amina's accident. Brightcore stood taller than ever, not just as a tech company, but as a living symbol of change. Under Amina's leadership, the culture had transformed from corporate coldness to community warmth. People no longer worked just for paychecks, they worked for purpose. Amina had become a national figure. Her speeches were replayed across social media, her story told in classrooms, leadership seminars, and even faith communities. She had become a voice for those who had been overlooked, judged, or underestimated, proof that dignity could thrive even in the face of prejudice. But fame didn't change her. She still arrived early, still listened more than she spoke, still greeted the janitors and interns by name. What she carried wasn't pride, it was gratitude. Yet even in her moments of success, she sometimes thought of Ethan. She wondered where he was, whether he had found peace. He had disappeared quietly, leaving no trace beyond the letter he left behind. Until one morning, when she received a call that would bring everything full circle. It came from a small coastal hospital 2 towns over. The voice on the other end was gentle, hesitant. The caller said they had a patient, an older man with no family, who had listed her name as his emergency contact. His name was Ethan Clark. Amina felt her breath catch. For a long moment, she said nothing. Then, without hesitation, she cleared her schedule and drove there herself. The hospital was quiet, bathed in soft afternoon light. When she entered the room, she saw him, frail, pale, and smaller than she remembered. The once imposing figure who had dominated boardrooms now looked fragile, almost peaceful. His eyes fluttered open as she approached, and when he saw her, a faint, grateful smile touched his face. He had been ill for some time, the doctors explained. Years of stress, heart trouble, and loneliness had worn him down. He had refused major treatment, saying he simply wanted to rest, to live out whatever time he had left quietly. Amina stayed for hours that day. They didn't talk much. They didn't need to. There was something sacred in the silence between them, a mutual understanding that words could no longer improve. In those quiet moments, she realized something profound. Forgiveness wasn't just about mercy. It was about release, freeing both the giver and the receiver from the chains of the past. Before she left, Ethan reached out weakly and handed her a worn notebook. Inside were handwritten pages, reflections, confessions, and memories of his mistakes. At the very end was a single line written shakily in pen. "You taught me that leadership isn't power. It's grace, and grace saved me." He passed away peacefully 2 nights later. Amina attended his funeral. Few people were there. A quiet service by the sea, with the wind carrying the scent of salt and closure. She stood by his grave as the waves rolled in and whispered a prayer, not of sorrow, but of gratitude. Because in the strange way life works, both of their stories had saved each other. He had given her the opportunity, even if through cruelty, to discover her strength, and she had given him the chance, through compassion, to discover his humanity. Back in the city, life went on. Brightcore continued to expand globally, becoming a model of ethical success. But for Amina, it was never about accolades. It was about using her platform to uplift others, especially those who were told, as she once had been, that they didn't belong. She launched initiatives for women in tech, scholarships for students from marginalized backgrounds, and a mentorship program dedicated to empowering young professionals from immigrant communities. Each time she stood on a stage speaking to a crowd, she could feel the weight of her journey in every breath. She remembered the pain, the rejection, the long nights spent questioning her worth, and how every one of those moments had led her here. But the story didn't end with her success. It ended with what she gave back. Because her greatest victory wasn't becoming CEO. It wasn't saving a company or surviving an accident. It was showing the world that compassion could be stronger than prejudice, that mercy could outshine revenge. And somewhere, in a quiet coastal town, the wind carried the echo of a lesson learned too late. The whisper of a man who had once refused to hire her, now remembered not for his cruelty, but for the woman who forgave him. Years later, a journalist interviewed Amina about her incredible journey. They asked her how she managed to stay so kind after everything she endured. The humiliation, the bias, the pain. She smiled softly and looked out the window, her reflection framed by the skyline she had once dreamed of. "Because," she said quietly, "if I had become what they expected, bitter, angry, small, then they would have won. But I didn't. I chose to build instead of break." Her words spread like wildfire, replayed across screens and hearts alike. They called it the Grace Quote, a line that would inspire millions long after she was gone. And as the video of her speech reached the world, from boardrooms to classrooms, from those who struggled to those who judged, her voice carried the same strength it always had, calm, steady, and unstoppable. The voice of a woman once told she didn't belong. The voice of a leader who proved that she did.